The carriage turned through the gates of Ashbourne Park on the second afternoon of October, and the rain had not let up since Cecily Marlowe left the village of Stowfield at dawn. She had watched the hedgerows blur past the window for 6 hours, and then the hedgerows gave way to stone walls, and the stone walls gave way to an avenue of bare oaks, whose branches crossed overhead like the ribs of a dark vault. And then the house appeared. It was larger than she had imagined. She had imagined it a great deal. In the weeks between the solicitor's visit and the morning she packed the last of what she owned into 2 trunks, and did not look back at the rooms where her father had kept his books. She had imagined something imposing, something cold, something with windows that watched the road. She had not imagined the sheer scale of it, the way it occupied the landscape as though it had always been there, and the landscape had grown up obediently around it. Gray stone under a gray sky, long rows of windows, smoke from 3 chimneys. Beautiful, in the manner of things that do not require your approval. The footman who opened the carriage door was young and did not meet her eyes. The housekeeper stood at the top of the stone steps with her hands folded. Behind the housekeeper, framed in the doorway, stood a woman of perhaps 58 with the posture of someone who had never once doubted her own authority. Her dark dress impeccable, a single strand of garnets at her throat. And at the top of the staircase that was just visible through the open door, at the first landing, stood a still figure in a dark coat, watching the carriage. Not moving. Not coming down. Lord Ashbourne did not come down to meet his new wife. Cecily stepped out of the carriage and straightened her back and told herself she had not expected him to. The marriage had taken place 3 weeks earlier in the village church at Stowfield, before the vicar and 4 witnesses. Her father's solicitor, Mr. Price, stood at one end. Her father's old housekeeper wept quietly. A footman from Ashbourne confirmed the ceremony on behalf of the estate, and Mrs. Holt, the head housekeeper of the Ashbourne estate, who had arrived with a bunch of white October asters and had stood very straight throughout. Lord Ashbourne had stood beside Cecily and said the required words in a low, level voice, and had not looked at her during the vows. She had not looked at him either. They had signed the register and walked out into the churchyard and stood for a moment in the thin autumn light, and he had said, "I will send a carriage for your trunks on the 7th. And then he had returned to Ashbourne without her. So it was not, she reminded herself, as though she had been deceived about the terms. She was 23 years old, and the daughter of a country solicitor who had kept careful accounts of everything except his health, and who had died in March, leaving behind a modest library, a worn armchair, a small sum of money that covered the funeral and very little else, and a debt of £400 to the Ashbourne estate that had accumulated over 3 years of poorly judged loans against a land dispute he had been retained to manage. The debt passed to Cecily. The solution, proposed in writing by a representative of the estate, had been a marriage. It would settle the debt. It would provide the estate with a countess. It would provide Cecily with security. She had not loved her choices. She had chosen anyway. Now she stood in the entrance hall of Ashbourne Park, the rain still audible on the stone outside. Her damp cloak gathered in her own arms because no one had yet taken it. And the woman with the garnets looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been delivered to the wrong room. "Lady Ashbourne," the woman said, in a tone that suggested the title was provisional. "I am Lady Sophronia Calder, Lord Ashbourne's aunt. I manage the household." "How do you do?" Cecily said. Mrs. Holt stepped forward before Lady Sophronia could speak again. She was a small woman, perhaps 60, with gray hair and a competent face, and she had been the one person at the wedding who had looked at Cecily as though she were a person and not an arrangement. "My lady," she said quietly, "I will show you to your rooms. You will want to change out of the damp." Later, Cecily would learn that Lady Sophronia had said, as the two women left the hall, her voice pitched low, but carrying to Mrs. Holt, who remained a moment behind, "A nobody from nowhere, and Edmund has bound himself to her. Heaven knows what Sophronia Holt is to do with it." Mrs. Holt, who had not answered, would tell Cecily this fact 6 weeks later, by which time they understood each other well enough for honesty. On the first evening, Cecily only knew that her rooms were clean and warm, and that someone had placed a small vase of the same white October asters from the wedding on the writing table, and she stood in front of them for a long moment before she understood that Mrs. Holt had put them there. She unpacked her 2 trunks herself. She shook out the gray morning dress and the pale green evening gown and the brown wool that was beginning to thin at the elbows. She arranged her few books on the shelf and set her writing things on the table. At the very bottom of the second trunk, wrapped in her winter shawl, was a small bound almanac, its leather cover creased and worn, a page and a half of notes in her father's handwriting, visible where the spine had been broken and not repaired. She had read it so many times that she knew the notes by heart. She set it on the window seat where the light was best in the mornings, and then she smoothed her dress and went down to dinner. Lord Ashbourne was not at dinner. Lady Sophronia sat at the head of the table and informed Cecily, without apparent apology, that his lordship often dined in the library when he had estate business. Cecily ate the soup and the fish, and did not ask how often that was. She did not see him properly for a week. He was present at breakfast on the 2nd and 4th mornings, already seated when she arrived, already rising when she had barely begun to eat, and both times she had the impression of a tall man with dark hair and a face that gave nothing away. A man who occupied space quietly rather than loudly, whose silences were not hostile but were not warm, who moved through the house as though the house were an instrument he was accustomed to playing without notes. He said nothing to her directly on the 2nd morning. On the 4th, he said, "The fire in the east sitting room is insufficient. Ring for someone to have it built up. You should not be cold in your own house." And then he had gone. His own house. She had turned the phrase over for a moment before filing it away. Not your house. His. She had rung for the fire anyway, and the fire had been built up. And when she passed the east sitting room that evening, it was warm enough to sit in. And she had sat there with her almanac in the lamplight and read her father's notes about the planting seasons, and felt for the first time since Stowfield that she might eventually learn to breathe in this place. Lady Sophronia was scrupulously civil to Cecily's face, and managed, by some art Cecily took time to understand, to be simultaneously present in every room Cecily entered, and wholly absorbed in other business. She directed the household with the confidence of a woman who had held that authority for years and saw no reason to relinquish it. She overruled 2 of Cecily's quiet requests, once regarding the menu for the week, once regarding a small change to the flower arrangement in the entrance hall, not by refusing them outright, but by simply not acknowledging them and proceeding as she had intended. It was expertly done. Cecily noted it and said nothing. What she had not expected from any of it was Thomas. Thomas Calder was 7 years old, with his father's brown eyes and his father's ungovernable hair, and a face that had learned, at 7, to carry a certain careful reserve, the way children do when they have been passed among adults who are doing their best, but are busy and distracted and grieving. His father, Edmund's younger brother, Lieutenant George Calder, had died at Salamanca 4 years ago, when Thomas was 3. His mother had died of fever the following winter. Thomas had come to Ashbourne and been installed in the nursery, and been given every material thing the estate could provide, and he was fed and clothed and educated, and entirely, quietly, alone. She met him on the 5th day, in the corridor outside the nursery, where he had stopped to examine a crack in the wainscoting with the focused attention of a scientist. He looked up at her without alarm and said, "There is a mouse behind this wall. I have heard it for 3 nights. Has anyone else heard it?" Cecily said. "I told Mrs. Holt. She said she would look into it. That was 2 days ago." He turned back to the crack. "I don't think she believed me." "Then we should mark where the sound is loudest," Cecily said, "so you can show her precisely." He looked at her then with the full weight of a child who has been taken seriously in an unexpected direction. "How?" "A small piece of chalk," she said. "Have you got any?" He had. They spent 20 minutes marking the wainscoting, and the mouse was located 2 days later, and Thomas appeared at the east sitting room door that evening to report this fact to Cecily, with the gravity of a man delivering news of strategic importance. After that, he came back. Not every day, but often enough that Cecily began to keep a set of papers on the low table in the east sitting room, in case he wanted to draw, and a small stock of answers to the questions he asked about horses and rivers, and the nature of inheritance, the last of which she answered as honestly as she could. It was in the 3rd week of October, 9 days after her arrival, that she first understood what the house thought of Lord Ashbourne's silences. She had gone out to the kitchen garden in the morning to ask about the parsley, a purely domestic question, and found Mrs. Holt at the back gate with a basket. They walked back together, and Mrs. Holt said, without preamble, "You are doing well, my lady." The compliment was quiet and meant to be private, and Cecily felt the weight of it. "Thomas seems lonely," Cecily said. Mrs. Holt was silent for a moment. "His lordship would agree with you," she said, "if he knew how to say it. He sees the boy every Sunday morning. They ride together on the home farm road." She paused. "He does not speak much when they ride. He goes every Sunday. He has not missed a Sunday in 4 years." Cecily thought about this as she went back inside. She thought about a man who had not come down to meet his wife, but who had not missed a Sunday morning ride with a fatherless 7-year-old boy in 4 years. These were 2 facts that did not resolve each other. She kept both of them. The rain came again on the 12th day. A sustained gray downpour that flattened the last of the autumn garden and left the path slick. Cecily had been in the east sitting room reading when she heard, from the direction of the back garden, the sharp sound of a child crying. She did not stop to think. She was out the side door and across the wet flagstones before she had properly framed the decision, and she found Thomas on his hands and knees at the bottom of the kitchen garden steps, a deep scrape across one palm, mud on his coat, crying with the particular anguish of a child who has fallen in front of no one and not been caught. She knelt down beside him without hesitation. The cold came through her skirts immediately. "Let me see," she said. He held out his hand. The scrape was clean, not deep. She did not say it was nothing. She said, "That stings." "Yes," he said, and swallowed hard. She produced her handkerchief and folded it and pressed it gently against his palm. "What were you running toward?" she said. "Before you fell." He blinked. "The back gate. I thought I saw a fox." "Did you see it?" "I don't know. Maybe. It was very fast." "We could walk the fence line tomorrow," she said. "If the ground dries. Foxes use the same paths. We might find prints." He was quiet for a moment. The crying had stopped. Then he said, "Are you cold?" "Yes," she said. "Come inside." She did not know that Lord Ashbourne had come to the back door in the middle of this, drawn by the same sound. She did not know he had stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her kneel in the mud and speak to the child without sentiment or fuss, watching her hold the handkerchief steady and ask what Thomas had been running toward as though the fox were the most important fact in the world. She did not see the thing that moved through his face in the moment before he stepped back inside. She only knew, the following morning, that there was a book left on the window seat beside her almanac. She had not put it there. It was a volume of the County Naturalist's Survey, well used, pages marked in several places. When she opened it to the first marked page, she found a passage describing the range and habits of the red fox in limestone country. There was no note. There was no indication of who had left it. She read the passage twice. Then she set it next to her almanac and went to find Thomas. The small shifts that followed were almost too quiet to name. Edmund began arriving at breakfast and remaining longer than his errand required. He did not manufacture conversation, but when Cecily spoke, he listened, and when he answered, the answers were more than one sentence. She noticed that he had a way of stilling completely when something interested him, a quality of absolute attention that was, once she understood it was attention and not censure, quietly absorbing. She noticed that he read widely and remembered what he read, and had no patience for received opinion. She noticed that when Thomas came into a room, Edmund's body registered the boy's presence before his face did. A small involuntary attention, the way a compass turns. She had asked him, one morning, about the foxes on the estate. He had answered without looking up from the letter he was reading. A precise, knowledgeable account of where they denned in the West Field, and why they came to the kitchen garden in October. Then he had looked up and said, without segue, "You should have better boots for the garden. The ground is soft for another 3 weeks." Then he had returned to his letter. She had gone and purchased better boots the following day, and she was not sure, walking back through the village, whether she was amused or moved. And she had decided eventually that the two things were not exclusive. If you have ever waited for a cold man to show you one true thing about himself, you know the particular quality of that waiting, the attention it requires, the discipline not to mistake courtesy for warmth or efficiency for care. Stay with Cecily a little longer. She is about to see something real. It was on a Tuesday in the last week of October that she went to the library in the late afternoon to return a volume she had borrowed from the lower shelves. The library was at the south end of the house, floor to ceiling, a room that smelled of good paper and old leather, and a fire burning low in the grate. She thought the room was empty. It was not. Edmund stood at the mantelpiece with a letter in his hand, not reading it, his back half to the door. On the mantelpiece before him was a small framed portrait, oval, watercolor on ivory, the size of a hand. A young woman with fair hair and a direct expression, painted in a style that Cecily placed at roughly a decade ago. She stepped back quietly. She was nearly out of the doorway when he said, without turning, "You do not need to go." She did not go. She came in instead, set the book on the nearest table, and stood at a careful distance. He did not turn for a moment. Then he set the letter down and faced her, and his expression was the one she had not seen before. Not the controlled public face, but the one underneath it, which was tired and very quiet. "My first wife," he said. "Charlotte. She died in childbed. 3 years ago in November, the child with her." He said it the way one recites a fact that has been recited so many times it has worn smooth, and yet the smoothness was clearly the result of work, not of distance. Cecily said nothing. She did not offer a conventional form of condolence. She had learned by then that he did not want the form of things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was in the library when she sent for me. Working. The steward had come with reports, and I had said I would not be interrupted." His voice did not change. The quality of the stillness in the room changed. She did not send again. Cecily stood very still. "I tell myself she would have sent again," he said, "if she had needed me. That she had the midwife and the physician, and there was nothing I could have done differently. The physician told me this. I have heard it a number of times. A pause. I do not find it alters the fact. No, Cecily said. I imagine it doesn't. He looked at her then with a quality of attention that was almost startled, as though he had not expected agreement. I carry her miniature, he said. It was not an explanation. It was, she understood, an admission of the weight of it. He touched the front of his coat briefly, the slight pressure at the breast pocket. I have been told I ought to have put it away. My aunt says so. It is yours to carry, Cecily said. Something moved through his face. Not relief, precisely. Something quieter than relief. He picked up the letter from the mantelpiece and folded it and set it aside. Then he said, You are cold. The fire in here has burned down. I will have it built up. He turned toward the bell pull with the efficiency that was, she now understood, the shape his care took. She did not go anywhere. She sat in the chair nearest the hearth and waited while the fire was built up. And when it was built, Edmund did not leave. He took the chair across from her and opened a different book from the table beside him, and they sat in the warm library in the late afternoon without speaking. And the portrait on the mantelpiece stood where it was, and the fire crackled. And outside the windows the October light came down through the oaks, and Cecily felt something in her chest ease slightly, the way a door opens on its first cold morning when the wood has swelled and the frame resists, and then the latch gives. The county dinner was Lady Sophronia's theater, and she produced it with the precision of a general who knows her ground. 22 places, the best of the county's notable families, the table set with the Ashbourne silver, the floral arrangements from the London florist rather than the estate garden. Cecily wore the pale green evening gown and her mother's pearl earrings, which she had not sold, and she sat at Edmund's right hand because she was his countess, though Lady Sophronia had contrived to ensure that Miss Dorothea Langford, daughter of Sir Robert Langford of Langford Hall, was seated to his left. Miss Langford was everything the season's vocabulary contained. Fair, composed, dressed in pale gold with a diamond pendant that caught the candlelight. She had been raised for precisely this kind of room, and she moved through it the way a boat moves through water it was built for. She spoke to Edmund with the familiarity of long acquaintance, not improperly, but pointedly. The familiarity of a woman who had been told, by someone with authority, that she was the correct choice, and had been unjustly denied it. Midway through the second course, the subject of the Ashbourne tenant farms came up. Miss Langford made a small, pleasant remark about the western acreage, referring to it as the Callow parcels, using the name with the confidence of someone who has been briefed. The western acreage is the Marlowe parcels, Cecily said mildly. The Callow lands were annexed to the Sutton estate in 1794. The surveyor's records are in the county archive. A silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It did not feel like 2 seconds. Miss Langford turned to look at her with an expression that was perfectly composed and entirely cold. How precise you are, she said. For a newcomer. My father was a solicitor, Cecily said. The Ashbourne estate was among his accounts for 11 years. I read his notes. She had not said it to display knowledge. The error had been wrong, and records existed to be correct, and there was nothing more to it than that. The table had heard it, and Lady Sophronia had heard it. And Lady Sophronia's expression had undergone a small, private rearrangement that Cecily noted with care. Edmund said nothing. An hour later, during the after-dinner assembly in the drawing-room, he crossed from the far side of the room to stand beside her, a movement that required passing the entire length of company, and said, very quietly, "The surveyor's records. You read your father's notes." "He was thorough," she said. "He was. Edmund said. He was looking out over the room. His voice, when he continued, was even. You do not need to explain your knowledge to anyone in this house. You have it. That is sufficient. She did not look at him. She looked at the room, the same room he was looking at, and felt something in her spine settle. If this story is going the way you hope it is, leave a note in the quiet, and return with her to the morning that tested everything. The report reached her on the first day of November in the blue sitting room, where Mrs. Alderton, the wife of the neighboring magistrate, had called with the ostensible purpose of welcoming Cecily to the county. Mrs. Alderton was a kind woman who could not hold news any longer than she could hold a too-hot teacup. I should not repeat it, she said, and then repeated it immediately. But Lady Sophronia mentioned to the gathering, at supper the night before last, that she had written to the London solicitors regarding the original marriage terms, that the arrangement had been entered under some irregularity, as she called it. Mrs. Alderton looked troubled. She said she wished only to ensure the estate's interests were properly represented. The implication, my dear, and the way it was put, it sounded very much as though she was suggesting the marriage itself might be reviewed. Cecily sat with this for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, and she kept them still. And, Mrs. Alderton added, in a lower voice, because she was genuinely kind and hated what she was saying, even as she said it. I heard Miss Langford say to Lady Hargreaves that nobody from nowhere had no business at Ashbourne at all, that everyone had always known it. Nobody from nowhere, said now, not as an assessment, but as a verdict, and passed through the room like a coin already spent. After Mrs. Alderton left, Cecily sat very still in the blue sitting room. She did not cry. She was not built for crying easily, which was either a gift or a deprivation depending on the day, and today it was simply a fact. What she felt was something colder than grief, and more controlled than anger. The old familiar settling of expectation. She had always known, had she not, that she was not the intended choice. She had told herself the marriage was a contract, practical and mutual, and contracts could be reviewed by those with the authority to review them. Edmund had gone to Ashford that morning on estate business. She did not know when he would return. She went to her room, and she began, methodically, to fold her dresses. Not with haste, with the careful, deliberate efficiency of someone who has learned that things must be packed neatly, because rooms must be left as you found them. She folded the gray morning dress and the brown wool and the pale green evening gown, with its pale green memory of the candle-lit dinner table, and she placed them in the trunk in order of weight. The almanac she did not pack. She set it on the window seat in the rectangle of gray November light, and she looked at it for a long moment. The cracked spine, the corners worn soft, her father's handwriting visible at the open page. The pressed lavender had long since lost its color, but she could still find it, flat and papery, tucked between the pages for October. Her father had pressed it the last autumn. He was well when the kitchen garden was still producing. She left the almanac where it was. She sat in the chair beside the window and looked at the gray park through the rain, and she was quiet. And the house was quiet around her. And she told herself that she was 23 years old, and she had survived worse calibrations of her worth. And she would survive this one. In the drawing room below, Lady Sophronia had arranged a small company for the afternoon, 3 of the county's most reliably conventional families, the Alderton sisters, and Miss Langford, who had arrived uninvited, but had not been turned away. Lady Sophronia sat at the center of the room with her customary authority, and said, in the tone of a woman managing a household difficulty with quiet efficiency, that she expected matters would be resolved to everyone's satisfaction in due course, and that she had every confidence Lord Ashbourne would see reason when the appropriate parties had communicated with him. No one asked what resolution she intended. No one needed to. The carriage came through the gates at 3:30 in the afternoon. Cecily heard it from her room, but did not go to the window. She sat with her hands folded and listened to the sound of boots on stone, the low exchange of voices in the hall, the particular silence that followed. Edmund had gone to Ashford to see the estate's senior solicitor, a Mr. Farley, who had written to him 10 days previously on a matter that Edmund had not mentioned to Cecily and had not mentioned to Lady Sophronia. He had been to Ashford, and he had read what Mr. Farley had prepared for him, and he had come home. He went first to the library. He was not in the library long. He went then to the east sitting room and found it empty. He went to the room Cecily used for reading and found it empty. He went to her rooms. The folded trunks were visible through the open dressing-room door. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he crossed to the window seat and saw the almanac. He picked it up with a careful, deliberate movement, the way a man handles something that belongs to someone else. He looked at the pressed lavender for a moment. Then he set it down exactly where it had been, and walked out of the room and down the stairs with a speed that was not quite haste, but was precisely directed. The way a man moves when he has decided something and is carrying out the decision before it can be interrupted. The drawing-room doors were open. Lady Sophronia sat at the center of the company, Miss Langford to her right. The county families distributed across the chairs and settees, with their cups and their expressions of comfortable anticipation. Edmund crossed the threshold and walked through the room to the center of it. Lady Sophronia had turned at the sound of his step, and her face, which had been confident, underwent a small and rapid adjustment. "Sophronia," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room had gone entirely quiet. "I have been to Ashford. I have read the terms of the marriage. I have spoken with Farley." "Edmund," Lady Sophronia said, "I merely wish to ensure that the estate's interests—" She began. "She is my wife," he said. "I will not hear otherwise." 11 words, level, plain, without drama. In the silence that followed them, Lady Sophronia's hand moved slightly on the arm of her chair, a small involuntary motion, as though she had reached for something and found it gone. Miss Langford looked at the middle distance with an expression that said she had understood and was leaving, and would not require assistance. No one spoke. The fire crackled. Someone's cup was set down in its saucer with a small, careful sound. "You will please send my wife to me," Edmund said to the room generally, and then he left. Mrs. Holt, who had been standing just outside the drawing-room doorway with a tray she did not need, set the tray down on the hall table and went upstairs. Cecily was still at the window when Mrs. Holt knocked and came in. She stood and listened, and then she followed Mrs. Holt down the stairs, through the quiet hall, to the library door. Edmund was standing at the fireplace with his back to the door when she entered. The portrait of Charlotte was still on the mantelpiece where it had been. He did not turn immediately. She came into the room and stood near the table, and waited. He turned then. He had her almanac in his hand. He had gone back upstairs and taken it from the window seat, and he was holding it now with the same careful deliberateness she had seen him apply to everything he considered worth handling correctly. "You did not pack it," he said. "No," she said. He looked at it for a moment. Then he crossed the room to her and held it out. She took it. His hand did not withdraw immediately. For a moment his fingers were near hers on the worn leather cover, and neither of them moved. "I went to Farley because he had evidence," Edmund said, that the debt attached to your father's estate had been overstated. The original agreement was altered after your father's death. The sum was not £400, it was 90. The arrangement should never have been framed as it was. He paused. I wished you to know that whatever you were told, you were not traded. The debt was a pretext. I chose this, Cecily. It was the first time he had said her name, not Lady Ashbourne, not a circumlocution, not my wife in the formal public register, but Cecily, the syllables placed with care in a low voice, and she understood from the way he said them that he had been holding the name at a private distance for some time, and had decided now was the moment to set down the distance. I owe you an honest account, he said, of why I agreed to the marriage when my aunt proposed it. I told myself it was practical. The estate needs continuity. Thomas needs a household that is more than a guardian and a housekeeper, and I had decided I would not be moved again. He looked at her steadily. I was wrong about the last part. She was quiet for a moment. The fire was bright. Through the library windows, the November rain had stopped, and the park was very still. The lavender, she said. In the almanac. My father pressed it the last year he was well. He said it was for the last good autumn, because the next one might not come. Edmund looked at the almanac in her hands. I read it when I am trying to remember that things that are lost were real, she said. That they happened, and cannot be taken from having happened. He was silent. Then he said, Charlotte had a particular way of laughing, very quiet, a sound she made when something delighted her that she had not expected to be delighted by. I find I cannot quite reconstruct it anymore. The miniature helps. Then carry it, she said, for as long as it helps. He looked at her with the quality of attention she had come to understand was his version of warmth. Absolute, still entirely directed. Then he said, Sit down, Cecily. It is late and you have not eaten. She sat. He rang the bell. The fire built. Thomas came down the back stairs at 6 o'clock, as he sometimes did in the evening, because no one had told him he was not allowed in the library, and he had learned that Cecily was often there. He found them both seated, a small table between them with plates and a lamp, Cecily with the almanac open on her knee, and Edmund reading. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, assessing the situation with a 7-year-old's pragmatic eye. There is fox sign in the west field, he reported. I went this afternoon. In the rain? Cecily said. It had mostly stopped, Thomas said, with the confidence of someone editing the facts toward the best case. He came into the room and stood between their chairs and looked at the book in Edmund's hands. What are you reading? Edmund turned the spine toward him. Thomas read it and said, I know that one. There's a chapter about foxes. He looked at Cecily. Did you know? I did, she said. He left it for her. Thomas said to Edmund, with the certainty of a child who has assembled a conclusion from insufficient evidence and arrived, in this case, exactly correct. I saw him put it on the window seat. Edmund looked at Cecily. Something moved through his face that was not quite the expression she had seen before. Quieter than that. Older than that. A man at the window of something he had thought long shuttered, finding the latch open. Go and wash your hands, he said to Thomas. You will eat with us. Thomas went, with the contained satisfaction of someone who has won a negotiation and is trying not to show it. The fire was high by the time they had eaten. Outside the library windows, the park had settled into full dark, the bare oaks standing quiet against a sky that had cleared to show a thin scatter of November stars. Thomas fell asleep in the deep chair by the bookcase, his boots on the upholstery, which he was not supposed to do, and which neither Cecily nor Edmund addressed. The room was warm and very still. Edmund's hand rested on the table between them, an inch from where Cecily's hand lay open beside her almanac. He did not reach across that inch. He did not need to. The distance had changed in character, had become something held rather than something insisted upon, and they both knew it. The portrait of Charlotte remained on the mantelpiece above the fire, the candlelight moving across it gently. It was still there in the morning, and the morning after that. It did not go anywhere. Neither did Cecily. By the first Sunday of December, Edmund resumed his habit of the Sunday morning ride on the home farm road, but this time there were 2 horses brought round instead of 1, because Cecily had said, one Thursday evening in the library, that she had not ridden enough since leaving Stofield, and he had said, without looking up from his letter, Sunday. She had said nothing else. He had asked no further question. On Sunday morning, the horses were there. They rode at a distance comfortable for talking or not talking, as the day required. On the 3rd Sunday, Thomas came too, his pony following behind with the particular dignity of a very small horse, accompanying a very small rider. They went out along the home farm road and turned at the old gate where the fox paths converged, and Thomas reported at length on the evidence he had been collecting, and Edmund listened with the same quality of absolute attention he gave to everything he considered worth attending to. And the morning was cold and clear, and the light came through the bare oaks the way Cecily's father had described the last good light in his notes. She thought of him then, her father, with the particular ache that is not grief exactly, but its long domestic cousin, the sense of someone not present who would have known how to account for this morning, who would have written something careful and true in his margin notes about the nature of things that are better than expected. She pressed her free hand briefly against her coat, where the almanac sat in her inner pocket, where she had taken to carrying it. Edmund, riding beside her, noticed. He said nothing. He rode on. The following morning, she found on the window seat of the east sitting room, beside her almanac, a small pressed sprig of lavender in a square of paper. Not old and colorless. Fresh from somewhere. She did not know, for a moment, how he had managed it in December, and then she remembered the kitchen garden and Mrs. Holt, and she understood. She stood at the window seat for a long moment holding the paper, the lavender still carrying the faint, dry scent of it. Impossibly. She thought. There it is. Not the grandeur she had been warned a feared lord might carry. Not the coldness she had braced for. Not the absence she had prepared herself to endure. Just a man who had not known how to say it plainly. You are real to me now, and I am glad you did not go. And I intend, if you will allow it, to do better than I have known how to do. A man who said it instead with a sprig of out-of-season lavender on a window seat. Because that was the language he had. She set the lavender carefully between the October pages of the almanac, next to her father's, and closed the cover. If you found what Cecily found in this house, leave it in the quiet below, and thank you for staying until the end.